Well, good evening. Turn with me tonight to the book of 1 Peter, the 3rd chapter. 1 Peter chapter 3. And we're going to be picking up where we left off back on March, I believe it was March the 15th. It's kind of disjointed, certainly after so long since we've been in the book of 1 Peter. This is what we were studying on Sunday evenings before COVID-19 came along. And we had already studied through the end of chapter 2. And so tonight we're going to pick up where we left off. And if your memory fails you as much as mine, then you may want to go back and go back through the lessons. They are available on our website, the previous lessons on this epistle. In fact, there are 10 lessons prior to this one. So you may be interested in doing that. They are available, as I said, on our website. Tonight we're going to be talking about marriage. So it's a very important lesson. In fact, I would say after Jordan's and Hayden's wedding yesterday, one of the ladies came up, someone related to Hayden. I don't remember what her name was. But she said she really appreciated the lesson because you just don't hear that stuff much anymore. You know, about marriage supposed to last for a lifetime. One man and one woman for life. And God's way is important. We need to understand it. And, you know, I do believe with all of my heart that one of the reasons why our nation is in the condition that it is in is because of the breakdown of the home. And we can talk about a lot of other reasons, but I believe at the heart of it is the breakdown of the home. And so, very important study. We have emphasized in this series, you don't remember this, but we've been emphasizing the fact we are pilgrims in this world. We're just passing through. You know, as we go through this journey in life, we're going to find all kinds of problems, all kinds of difficulties, all kinds of hurdles. Some may come along, turmoil in our country and fear from outside forces. Maybe it's a little virus, you know, that's going to interrupt everything. We have really been hurt by this COVID-19 since March. You know, we've had so long a period now where we were not on our regular schedule and people kind of got used to staying home, I'm afraid. Some have kind of drifted away. In fact, I know some who have drifted away from the truth. And it's certainly sad to see. But we are pilgrims and we must, as we talked about this morning, hold fast to the truth. This homeland that we are going towards is spoken of as our living hope in chapter 1 and verses 3 and 4. This living hope is something we are to strive with all of our might to gain. And we must look at everything in life through that prism. Everything needs to be viewed from the perspective of this world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. Our living hope is to be our focus. We are to be holy while we're in this life. Chapter 1, verses 13 beginning, and through chapter 2 and verse 3. We talked about Jesus being our cornerstone. He's either going to be our cornerstone or He's going to be our stumbling stone in this life. We're either going to believe Him and obey Him, or we're not going to believe Him and not obey Him. That's our choice. But what is He to you? Is He going to be your foundation stone of life, or is He going to be your stumbling stone? Abstain from fleshly lust, which war against the soul. Chapter 2, verses 11 through 12. We talked about the need to abstain from these fleshly desires that come along. And we need to remember we're pilgrims in this world, striving to serve and obey our God and be holy. Response to human government. In chapter 2, verses 13 through 17, the Apostle Peter enforces this idea that is also taught by the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 13. We are to obey our governing authorities. And one of the problems that stems from a breakdown of the home is the breakdown in society of its respect for authority. When we lose our respect for authority, then we're going to crumble. Anarchy is not our friend, and it's going to destroy us. So we need to obey, submit to the governing authorities that God has established. Now, we may not like the authorities that be, but God has a reason for allowing those that are to exist. Nebuchadnezzar learned this, and so we must realize every ruler is there because God allowed that to happen. Even Pharaoh was there for a reason. So we need to understand that. Response to abusive authority. Even if we are suffering at the hands of those who are over us in this life, we still have a master, a Lord that we're to submit to, and that's Jesus Christ. And we're to do what He tells us to do. And even if that authority that's over us in this world is abusive, we still must behave as Christians. Okay? So now that brings us to chapter 3. A God-honoring marriage. What does that look like? The Apostle Peter emphasizes that we are heirs together of the grace of life. Talking about a husband and a wife. They're to be joint heirs together in this thing we call life to help each other get to heaven. And I want to say to you, for those who are yet looking to marry in the future, I talked to Maddox yesterday. I said, you're next then, aren't you? Okay, we've got Autumn and we've got Ashton and Cameron and then Jordan, and who's next? He said, not for a while. I hope that's right. But, you know what you need to be asking yourself when it comes to marriage? Will this person help me get to heaven? I don't know of a more important question to ask. When you're looking for a mate, you need to be asking that question. Will this person help me get to heaven? So, with that in mind, beginning in verse 1, wives likewise, be submissive to your own husbands, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives. When they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear, do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. For in this manner, in former times, the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are, if you do good and are not afraid with any terror. Now, that's the text. Well, hold on, I'm not done yet. Verse 7. See, wives, you thought I was just going to be talking to you. Nope. Look at verse 7. Husbands, likewise dwell with them with understanding, giving honor to the wife, as to the weaker vessel, and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers may not be hindered. I told Cameron earlier this afternoon, he texted me, wanted to know what the lesson was on tonight, and I told him. He was planning on leading singing, and I told him I was going to be preaching to Stephanie. But he nor Stephanie are able to be here because of his health issues, but I'm not just talking to wives tonight. This is for both wives and husbands. The principle of submission. We've already noticed the principle back in chapter 2, didn't we? Governmental authorities. We're to submit to the governing authorities. And that doesn't matter, by the way, whether they're good or bad. Think about it. Who was the emperor of Rome when Peter wrote this? Who was the emperor of Rome when Paul wrote Romans 13? It was Nero. And Nero was a very bad guy. He was as wicked as they come. Just immoral, ungodly, hated God. And so you've got that to be keeping in your mind. When Peter and Paul say submit to the governing authorities, he doesn't mean only if they're good. He means submit to governing authorities. The servant and the master relationship in chapter 2, servants, submit to your masters in all things. Even to the harsh, Peter says. Even to the abusive authority. You behave like a Christian. Okay? You behave like a child of God. Humbly persevering and being obedient to God, because trust God enough to realize that one day God's going to make every wrong right. God hasn't placed in our hands the right to bring retribution to these ungodly people. God has reserved that right for Himself, and He's going to take care of that one day. He wants you to be submissive in all things. He wants you to be obedient to those who are over you in this life. Now we get to chapter 3, and guess what? That same principle is applied to the wife. Likewise, the principle of submission applies to the wives, submitting to their own husbands. Notice, wives likewise be submissive to your own husbands. Likewise to what? To the previous examples of authority in government and the authority even of abusive masters. Now you have the principle applied to wives. Even if your husbands are not obedient to the word. He's talking about wives being married to unbelievers. I've known many godly women married to unbelievers. I've known many, typically, in my experience, women are more faithful to the Lord than men. That's been my experience growing up. The women have been more faithful to the Lord than men. Now, it ought to be reversed. It ought to be the other way around. It ought to be that men are the most faithful. The men are to be the leaders, the spiritual leaders of the home. You're to be the head of your wife, and you're to lead them in the ways of God. You're the one who needs to be showing the way. So, we also realize that's not always the case. And wives, even if your husbands are not godly men, you are still, as far as your role is concerned in this life, you are still to be submissive to your own husband. Even those who are unbelievers. The practice that is spoken of here, submission. We've talked about this already. The Greek term means a willing act. You're placing yourself under. It doesn't mean that you're less valuable, that you're worth less. It means actually you're the same in value, but it's your role that you have as the woman. And this doesn't go back just because God is chauvinistic. That's not it. It's that from the very beginning, Eve sinned and led her husband into sin. Paul talks about that in 1 Timothy chapter 2. And so you've got that as the foundation for this principle. But husbands are to be over the wives, and the wives are to place themselves under the husband. Many wives are much smarter than their husbands. I know that for a fact. I've got one. And so I think a lot of others out there have the same situation. Your wives are a lot smarter than you are. And wives, you know that you're smarter than your husband. You know it, right? But yet you are to take your place. And it's one of willing acceptance. And so you are to accept your place under the leadership of your husband, whom God has placed as the head of the home. Even if your husbands are unbelievers. Now, this principle is taught in Ephesians 5:22, Colossians 3:18, Titus 2:5. Wives, submit to your own husbands. Over and over. You've got a fourfold witness there telling you this. In the Old Testament, of course, substantiates that. This is not something that our secular society can change, regardless of how much it wants to. Regardless of the women's liberation movement of the 60s and 70s. That is irrelevant to the Word of God. The Word of God lives and abides forever. It is the truth. And we need to abide by that truth. Subjection is a role to be filled and does not imply inferiority in the sight of God. Male and female are all one in Christ Jesus as far as their value and their worth is concerned to Him. But that does not negate the roles that He has placed upon men and women. We need to accept those roles. Peter demonstrates how godly living can be a powerful influence in the lives of others. Now notice he says, that even if some do not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives. These unbelieving husbands, what is the best opportunity for the wife, the godly wife, to convert their husband? Is it to nag him to heaven? That usually doesn't work very well. Nagging your yes, it is true. The squeaking wheel gets the grease. That's true. And so you may just yield to your wife because you're tired of her nagging you all the time. So you do what she would have you to do. And there may be some benefit to that, just from the external perspective. But I'll tell you what's really going to change your husband and that is your godliness, your faithfulness, your consistency in your obedience to the Lord Jesus Christ. That is what's going to be the most impressive upon him. We need to understand the power of influence. Matthew 13:33, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. You know, that's a metaphor that is used in two different ways. It is used in the good sense, as in Matthew 13:33, the kingdom of heaven is like leaven. And it's also used in a bad sense, right? We'll talk about that in just a minute. But the unbelieving husband might be saved by the godly behavior of their wives, even without a word. The idea is your influence. It's what you do that's going to mean a lot more to your husband than what you say. We understand that principle, don't we? It's not what you say, it's what you do. And it's the doing of the wife that's going to have the most influence over their husband. Matthew 5:13 through 16, we're to be the salt and the light of the earth. Wives, if you are godly, your husband's not, you need to be that salt and that light in that marriage. You need to be the guiding influence. And you can do that without stepping outside of your role. That's Peter's point. In contrast, we should never underestimate the damaging effect of inconsistent, ungodly behavior. That's going to do more damage than good. If the wife behaves ungodly, then that's not, she can preach one thing but live another. The preaching isn't going to have any effect at all. It's the godly behavior that's important. And Peter is stressing that. Even without a word, you may win your husband. So, a little leaven, leavens the whole lump in a bad sense, right? 1 Corinthians 5:6, 1 Corinthians 15:33. Don't be deceived. Be not deceived. Evil communication corrupts good morals. You understand, I hope, the power of negative influence. So you be that good influence. Now, he says, when they observe, the husbands, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. Chaste conduct. The word chaste emphasizes the idea of purity. All right? That is purity in all manner of your life. And this is accomplished through your obedience to God. When we obey God, certainly we are walking a righteous path in our life. We are obeying Him, thus we are pure through that obedience. And that's the point that Peter is making here. You be obedient. You be godly. True godliness is observable. If you have to tell somebody that you're godly and they can't look at your life and tell it, you got a problem. Godliness is observable. And so you let your works do the talking. Chaste behavior, your chaste conduct, accompanied by fear. First and foremost, our fear must be in the Lord. Reverence toward God. God comes first in everything that I do. I'm obedient to God. And by the way, here's a very important point. When you talk about the concept and principle of submission, whether it be to the government, whether it be to masters, or whether it be to your husbands, listen, remember this rule. We must obey God rather than men. And if a man tells you to do something that God forbids you to do, you must say with Peter and John, we must obey God rather than men. If your husband commands you not to do something that God commands you to do, you say, I must obey God rather than men. And you do what God tells you to do. And you're not disobeying your husband. You're still in submission, but you're putting God first, you see. And God must always come first in your life. You must always demonstrate consistently your reverence towards God. Wives submit to their husbands. You do that because you reverence God. You don't do it, by the way, because your husband deserves it. That's not the criteria that determines whether you should submit to him or not. It has nothing to do with him deserving it or not deserving it. It has nothing to do with his godliness or his ungodliness. It has to do with the fact this is what God said for you to do. It has to do with the fact that you're to obey God and submit to Him. And He's put you in your role. You need to accept that role and fulfill that role. It is not depending upon the worthiness of your husband. Same thing is true with the government. Romans 13 verses 5 and 6, we're to submit to the governing authorities. But there is the principle, the overriding principle. If the government tells you to do something that God forbids you to do, then you must obey God rather than man. So always keep that in mind. But you're putting God first with fear. You respect and reverence Him, and you take your place because of your respect for God. Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. The New King James adds that word merely there. That word merely is, as you see in italics, that means it's been added by the translator. And I do believe it correctly renders the meaning of Peter here. He's saying, don't emphasize or overemphasize your external beauty. It's not all about your external beauty. But rather let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. This is a Hebraism. It's a not this but this type constructed sentence. Much like John 6 and verse 27. Do not labor for the meat that perishes, or the food that perishes, but labor for that which does not perish. In other words, Jesus is saying this is not as important as that is important. Must we work for the food that we get? Yeah. If a man doesn't work, neither let him eat. But we must work, but we must recognize that there's something more important than the food that we have for our bodies. That is the food that we need for our spirit. That is more important. It's a not but constructed sentence. It's not the outward beauty, but the inward beauty. That is the most important. And that's exactly what Peter is saying here. Do not let your adornment be merely outward. Nothing wrong with being beautiful. Nothing wrong with having nice things and nice clothes. You know, there are those who interpret this passage, that, well, a woman can't wear makeup, she can't wear jewelry, she can't fix her hair. She just needs to be ugly all the time. And no, that's not what the Bible teaches. Sarah was a beautiful woman. The point is, it's not this outward adornment, arranging of hair that is the most important, but rather the inward person, the inward beauty, the incorruptible beauty of the heart that is most important. And that's where our focus needs to be. A gentle and quiet spirit is true and incorruptible beauty. That's Peter's point. Your accepting your godly position in the home is much more beautiful in the sight of God than anything that you can put on to dress up, to make yourself beautiful to men. You need to be beautiful to God. And you do that by developing this gentle, this meek and quiet spirit. The word meek or gentle here means that you are placing yourself under that authority that God has placed over you. It doesn't mean that you do not have the power to buck that authority. Just like a horse. I've used this illustration, and I know you've heard it many times. A horse is much more powerful than you are. When I was a young man, I rode horses a lot. We rode in horse shows, and I was around horses all the time. We had horses on our place, and I had a horse named Checker, and he was a really good horse. He was a fast quarter horse, and my buddy Jack lived next door, and he had a thoroughbred quarter horse mix. His name was Monty. And that horse was fast. He won the state speed record back in the, I guess it was 81, something like that. And in fact, he won the state, and he fell down doing it. He fell down going around the barrel in Heston Stadium in Palm Bluff. That's where the state horse show was that year. Monty fell down, and he got up and still won state. That was a fast horse. But, okay, I was around horses a lot. I had one horse. That horse did not want to be ridden one day. So when I got up on her, she started bucking. She couldn't throw me off. So you know what she did? She sat down and she rolled over. So I had to get off. I didn't have much of a choice then, did I? But that horse demonstrated right there, it wasn't meek in that situation. When you break a horse, that horse, even though it's more powerful than you, and it can get you off if it wants to, The horse, if it's broken, will let you tell it to do whatever you want it to do. If you want it to go to the right, you just touch its neck on the left with the reins, and that horse will go to the right. If you want it to go to the left, just touch it, and it'll go to the left. You can make that horse do anything you want it to do. You can make it back up. You can make it go fast. You can make it go slow. You've got the controls with your reins and your feet. And that horse will do anything you tell it to do. That is a perfect illustration of meekness. Even though that horse has the power to buck you off if it wants to, it submits to your authority. That's what meekness is. And that's what a woman is to do. She is to accept that role, even though she is smart enough, she is strong enough emotionally and willed enough. She can buck off that authority if she wants to. But she is to accept that role. And that, to God, is more beautiful than anything she can put on and fix herself up in appearance to be. Proverbs 11 and verse 22 talks about might as well put a gold ring in a hog's snout as to have an unchaste woman. You're wasting your gold. And that's the point, all right? So that's beautiful in the sight of God. Accepting God's appointed role, submission. You're submitting to your own husbands as God ordained. Not because you're not smart enough or strong enough to make it on your own. It's because this is God's order. And to please God, this is what you do. And this is beautiful in the sight of God. And it's for your good, by the way. It is what makes everything work as it's supposed to. Chaste conduct, holiness, purity, free from carnality, modest. Modest. That means you're not dressing and you're not acting in such a way that draws attention to yourself. You're not saying, hey, everybody, look at me. Respectful, reverence for God and submitting to your husband. That is showing proper reverence for the Lord. You cannot honor God by disobeying God. Gentle, meekness, submitting to the yoke. This is true strength, by the way. You're truly expressing self-control. Quiet spirit, tranquility of disposition, not self-assertive or busybody. You are not always going around engaging in everything, getting your hand in everything, trying to run everything. You have a quiet, gentle spirit. So, Peter then says, for in this manner in former times, the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are, if you do good and are not afraid with any terror. Sarah here is exalted, and she is pointed out as being a godly woman because she submitted to her husband. Now, there were times, she's just like everybody else, right? That's one of the great things about Old Testament characters or biblical characters. They're all human beings just like us, and they make mistakes. And Sarah wasn't perfect, but she did submit to her husband. And that is to what Peter is referencing here. She was a beautiful woman outwardly. Pharaoh wanted her when she was over 65 years old. And the king of the Philistines wanted her when she was over 90. She was a beautiful woman in her 90s. So she was a beautiful woman, but her true beauty is demonstrated in the fact that she was submitting to her husband, submitting to his authority. And so if you want to be a daughter of Sarah, if you want to be pleasing to God, then you need to accept your role and fulfill your duties and your responsibilities that God has placed upon you, with not with regret or bitterness or envy, but accept it with joy and fulfill your responsibilities. And Glenn Campbell sang that song years ago, "The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world." It is when women truly take their place in the home, they fulfill their wifely and their motherly duties, that they truly exhibit true power in the world and have the greatest influence in the world. God has His purposes. We may not fully understand those purposes, but God has His reasons. He has His purposes. He has equipped you for that role. And it's a necessary role. It's a valuable role. And without that role, the world is doomed. So, husbands, Husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding. Again, likewise. What does that mean? Likewise. There is a real sense in which husbands are to be very respectful and honoring of their wives, and respect their desires and their wishes and think about their needs at all times. You should be... Okay, I'm going to use this as an illustration since Denise isn't here. Whenever we talk about what we're going to eat, I'll call her every day when I'm leaving the office. What do you want for supper? You want me to bring you something? And she says, well, whatever you want. And you know what my answer always is? Always. Honey, it's whatever you want that matters. That's it. You choose. Because I'll eat anything. I don't care. Whatever makes her happy makes me happy. And that's the way a husband ought. I think that's the way a husband ought to look at his wife and her desires. Whatever makes her happy makes him happy. And so husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding. Okay? Giving honor to the wife. Okay, clicker, come on now. First of all, when he talks about understanding, dwell with them with understanding. Husbands need to understand their role. Their role is to be the head of the home, but it's being a head that is of loving character and desiring to please and to serve and provide. It is motivated from love. You understand your own responsibilities to be the spiritual leader of the home. You're wanting what is best for your wife. You're wanting what is best for your children. So understanding your own responsibilities first and foremost. Likewise, dwell with them with understanding. But although I think that Peter's main point here is husbands need to be understanding of their wives. Now, that perhaps is the most difficult command in all of the Bible. Husbands, understand your wives. I don't know of anything that's more difficult than that. Husbands, I don't know of any one of you that would disagree with me. I would ask for a show of hands, but I know every man's hand would go up. I know it. Is there anything more difficult? Well, I'm just thankful that Peter doesn't mean here that we have to understand everything about our wife, because I really do believe that's an impossible feat. But it does mean that we're to be understanding of their needs. We're to be understanding of their desires. We are to understand, women, and I watched a video years and years ago. Gary Smalley had these videos. I don't know if any of you ever watched those. Gary Smalley. Anybody remember him? He had all these videos on marriage. And one video, he was talking about the differences between men and women. For example, guys, when you go to Walmart and you're going to get something, if you know where that thing is, when you go in the doors at Walmart, you go straight to that thing, you get that thing off the shelf, and you go straight to the checkouts, and you go right out the door, you paid for it, you're gone, okay? I could be in and out of Walmart in 2 minutes and 15 seconds if there's no line. I know what I want, I go and I get it. We're hunters. That's what we do. We go out and we provide, we get, and that's just us, When we're going somewhere, we're traveling, for the most part, now there are exceptions to these rules, but this is a general rule. Guys, when we're driving somewhere, we know where we're going, we type it in these days in our GPS. They didn't have GPS back then. Had maps, but you knew how long it took you to get from point A to point B. And you were going to try to beat that record. You're going to get there as fast as you can. Women aren't like that. They're not like that in Walmart. They're not like that when they're riding in the car. They see something, they want to stop and look at it. They see an antique store. Oh, let's stop and let's go in and look. They go to Walmart and they go, I want to look at this and I want to look at that and I want to see this and I want to see that. I would go shopping with my mama. And I'm telling you, every time we would go in the grocery store, she would touch everything on every shelf in that grocery store before we left. She would take it off and she'd look at it and she'd put it back up. And when she'd go shopping for clothes, she would look at all the clothes and I'm just standing there like, oh, come on, let's go. But that's okay. Generally speaking, differences between men and women, those differences are real. Okay? They're real. I don't understand all about it, but I do know this, and I do understand this, that women do have desires and they do have needs, and we need to be respectful of those, even though we may not understand all the details behind it. We need to respect our wives, and we need to acquiesce to their request on all these things that's unique to them, and we need to be understanding of that. We need to understand their spiritual, their emotional, and their physical needs, and do everything we can to provide them. It's always, the answer to every question is, whatever you want, honey. That's typically the answer. And so be understanding. Now, of course, that's in, as long as it's in harmony with God's will. That's the overruling factor. But in other words, it's always what makes you happy. What do you want? Give honor. Respect her. Treat her as precious, valuable. Treat her as the valuable possession that she is, even when she doesn't deserve it. Even when she's not what she ought to be. Just like wives are to submit to their husbands even when they're not what they ought to be. Husbands are to respect and value their wives even when they are not what they ought to be. That's what love does. Love is not just a feeling. It's not how you feel in the moment. Love is a commitment. It is truly valuing the object of your love. And love is a commitment. It is predicated upon your devotion and commitment to God first, and you're fulfilling your duties and your responsibilities to your wife. Give honor, respect her, treat her as precious, of high value. That's exactly what Paul means in Ephesians chapter 5 when he talks about husbands, love your wives even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. He didn't give his life for the church because the church was so good. He didn't give his life because the church was so godly and righteous. He gave his life because the church wasn't. He valued us regardless. As to the weaker vessel, there's a lot of different views on this. My view is that Peter is talking about primarily the physical and emotional needs of the wife. And generally it's true, and again, there are exceptions to this, most men are stronger than their counterparts. Now, this is something that's really broken down in our society today. With all this gender identification and all this craziness that's going on. There was a lawmaker here just last week trying to push a law through to have men compete in women's athletics. Now, I tell you, if you can see this principle anywhere, you can see it there. All right, let's take the best female basketball player, and let's put her on the court with LeBron James and Michael Jordan and see what happens. Or let's put them on the football field. Line them up across from these big old 350-pound offensive linemen and see what happens. I think we know what would happen. You have a football team of women, and you get you a football team of NFL superstars. You can have the best women you can find, and you can get the superstars of the NFL and see what happens. Now, I think that's what Peter is talking about, but it's not exclusive to that. Because in the day, back then, and this is still true today, men take advantage of their physical ability, their physical strength, and their power over women. And they abuse that power. They abuse that authority. And so Peter's instruction here is to emphasize honor the wife as the weaker vessel. Just because you're bigger than her, just because you're stronger than her, just because you can make her do whatever you want, that ain't how it's done. You lead by example. You lead with love and respect. Honor her. Don't abuse your authority. And yes, there are emotional tendencies. And by the way, going all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, it was Eve that was deceived. It was Eve that was deceived. And that goes back to the differences between men and women. There are differences. Left brain, right brain, however you want to talk about it, Venus and Mars or whatever. There are differences. And there is a built-in tendency in women. They are more, generally speaking, more emotional creatures. They just are. Men are more, just like at Walmart. You don't know what you're going to get. You go and you get it. You've got this. This is practical for you, right? It's practical. And many times there are disagreements between a husband and wife, and the husband says, this is just a practical thing to do. And the wife says, but that's not what I want. That's not how I feel about it. And she's got a point. And so it's not always what's practical. Okay, don't want to get too far off there, but I do think that's the main point. Don't abuse your ability to enforce your will on your wife. You need to treat her, even though she is the weaker vessel, you need to treat her with respect. Honor her, value her opinion, value her desires. She's certainly not weaker intellectually. As I've already pointed out, there are many women more intellectual, smarter than their men counterparts. Their moral courage, many times much stronger. They're going to stand firm. Or their spiritual strength. So, husbands, you respect the wife. Honor her. As being heirs together of the grace of life, husbands and wives are to share together in the life that God has given them. Mike Willis, in his commentary, talked about this application and what this really means. And he points out some of the differences. I know the Bible Knowledge Commentary talks about how this could be either the physical life that they're together in this world as pilgrims, or it could be focused on their spiritual life and how the husbands are to guide them into a spiritual life. And so perhaps, just like with the wives who are to submit to their husbands, even if they are not believers, the husbands are to also respect their wives and love them and help them to become believers. And that's a possibility. But I think that Peter's main point is that we are together in this thing called life. And we are on a journey as pilgrims striving to serve and please God, and we need to do everything we can together to help each other get there. The ungodliness of one affects the life of the other. Regardless of how godly the wife is, if the husband is ungodly, that's going to affect her. That's going to hinder her in some ways. That's going to be a burden to her. That's why it's so important when you're choosing your mate, you choose somebody that's going to help you get to heaven. Because if you choose somebody that's not interested in heaven, you're going to have a hard way to go. So the ungodliness of one affects the life of the other. Husbands and wives need to help each other get to heaven. That's what this is all about. How a husband and wife treat each other directly affects their relationship with God. Wives, you cannot rebel against your husband and be in a right relationship with God. Husbands, you cannot disrespect your wife and treat her as some insignificant thing and be in a right relationship with God. You have to obey God in order to be in a right relationship with God. Heirs together in the grace of life. We are but pilgrims in this world. We are just passing through. And God has given us the wonderful institution of marriage, through which and by which we can help each other through this difficult world and get to heaven together. We're heading to a hope that is eternal. And it's worth everything we've got to help each other get there. This homeland that is spoken of as our living hope is worth all of the things that we can sacrifice in this life to obtain it. And we need godly mates by our side, hand in hand, helping one another achieve the most important thing, the most valuable thing that there is, and that is everlasting life. Wives, likewise be submissive. Adorn yourselves with the inward beauty that God desires. Be godly. Husbands, dwell with your wives with understanding. Give honor to the wife. Respect her. And in all things, both husbands and wives help each other get to heaven. Are you helping your spouse get to heaven? Are they helping you get to heaven as they should? Maybe they're not. And maybe there's a burden in your life because of that. What you need to do is be godly yourself. Listen, you cannot change somebody if they don't want to change, but you can change yourself. You can be who you ought to be. And if you're who you ought to be, that will influence your spouse like nothing else can. Maybe you're here tonight and there's something that we can do to help you. If one who needs to obey the gospel, if there's something in your life that you need to correct, we encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity, and we invite you to come while together we stand and while we sing.